I'm Van Sebastian here with this week's Written on the Edge, a Season 9, Episode 22 interview. I'll be talking with Sven Davisson of Rebel Satori Press, discussing his latest book and the press's upcoming release lineup. Let's get to know my guest. Sven Davisson is the innovative force behind Rebel Satori Press, an independent publishing house dedicated to pushing boundaries and amplifying marginalized voices. With a keen eye for compelling narratives and a commitment to fostering diverse literary landscapes, Davisson curates a catalog that challenges conventions and sparks dialogue. Under his stewardship, Rebel Satori continues to be a beacon for groundbreaking literature that resonates with readers seeking fresh perspectives. Sven's other works include The Starry Dynamo, The Star Set Matrix, and the story Dim Star Descried in the Matter Love, Queer Men, and the Precincts of Surrealism. And if you haven't heard our previous interviews, I'd also like to introduce Rebel Satori Press to you. Since 2002, it's been committed to releasing cutting-edge fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction, with an emphasis on amplifying LGBTQIA+ voices, promoting diversity through the press and its imprints Queer Mojo, Queer Space, Araby Manor, and the Library of Homosexual Congress. They are dedicated to safeguarding the voices of our heritage, a mission and creed which just stands hand in hand with this podcast. Sven, welcome back. We are so honored to have you.
No, thanks for having me again.
Our pleasure. So before we dive into the press stuff, you've got a book coming out this summer.
Yes, finally took a break to work on my own book. So Breeding Devils in Chaos, which, when I start something, I don't think I'm going to get past 10,000 words.
Look at that.
I think it's about 120,000 at this point.
Wow. So it is nonfiction.
Correct.
And a look at magic and spiritualism through a masculine filter. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's sort of a re-queering of the male mysteries.
Beautiful.
And it's one beta reader describes it as expansive because it sort of goes everywhere from, prehistoric, Neolithic and Paleolithic Britain all the way up to postmodernism.
Nice. So it's broken into 3 larger sections, right?
Correct. It's sort of a historical antecedents, and then more of a philosophical section of folklore, and then a sort of practical working section of the book.
Nice.
Book of Shadows, as they would say in various witchcraft traditions.
And it's
probably the only witchcraft book that has the antecedents are Oscar Wilde, Aleister Crowley, Michel Foucault, and William S. Burroughs.
Not a bad lineup, though. So for folks who are interested in picking this up, we should probably define a couple terms. I know chaos magic comes up a lot. Look at that smile.
And I didn't actually intend it to be a chaos magic book, but chaos, I guess, is in the title, so it was a little bit inevitable.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
So chaos magic is, I guess, best described as a postmodern form of occultism based on meme adoption. So sort of whatever works, and you sort of put things together out of history. I actually, in the book, link it to the rise of queer activism. So okay. The chapter on chaos magic is paired with a chapter on the I Hate Straights pamphlet that was distributed at New York Pride around 1990, somewhere around there.
I missed that.
We have to read the book.
Yeah, apparently.
It was an anonymous collective issued it, and it was a broadside that was literally thrown out as a newspaper sort of broadside. And it basically was the start of Queer Nation.
Interesting. So my first tripping into the term chaos magic was actually Aleister. Had it existed before him?
No, it really comes out in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. Peter Carroll was one of the main proponents.
Okay.
The early proponents. Grant Morrison is probably the most famous person who's talked and written about it. His Invisibles graphic novel series is very much based on chaos magic.
Okay. And should we tell people what it is? Because it just sounds sort of dangerous.
No, not at all. It's actually kind of fun. So it's just mixing up things that work, from meditation to deity forms to old time ceremonial magic.
Sort of a build your own paradigm.
Like it was really hard to define the book, actually, and that was one of my beta readers said, go back and add another paragraph above the paragraph you thought was the one defining it.
Would it be safe to say it's kind of a build your own paradigm?
Yes, but not. So I'm also anti-eclecticism. So like the New Age movements sort of adopt everything wholesale and pick and choose as sort of an a la carte menu. For me, it's more practicing a tradition is more about getting into the tradition as much as possible, as opposed to, and also knowing its cultural roots. Like one example I use in the book is, smudge sticks are everywhere now, but every New Age store has different types of smudge sticks now and all colorful wrappings and things. But few people actually look at where the smudge tradition comes from. It's indigenous, the connection with indigenous peoples, and also the harm that harvesting sage is doing on the environment in California.
Interesting.
So I propose I'm got an English, Scottish, Norwegian background. So as opposed to smudge, I propose seining, which is using juniper bundles for the same sort of purpose. But it's a tradition that's more culturally closer to my own ancestral heritage.
Okay. Now, can we talk about tying that to male mysteries?
So there was so there's two ways it ties together. My own personal lineage goes back to Eddie Buzinski, who created, he was partner of Herman Slater, who owned the Magical Child shop in New York City in the 70s and 80s, which was essentially the epicenter of everything occult in the country, or at least in New York. And they were gay men. They were in the more traditional Gardnerian, Alexandrian, Welsh traditions, which are very encoded in the tradition as a heteronormativism. Everything's male, female paradigm, the Lord and the Lady, the God and the Goddess.
Right.
And created a tradition called the Minoan Brotherhood, which is for gay men. And then there's the Minoan Sisterhood, which is for gay women. And it flips that around for a more sort of homocentric paradigm and mythos. So it builds on my history with that tradition. And then there was also Arthur Evans, who wrote Witchcraft and the Gay Counterculture back in the 70s. It was published by Fag Rag in Boston. It was an important book that in some ways founded the radical fairy movement and looks at how there have been queer men involved with witchcraft going back to the Middle Ages, that the witch burnings were just as much about difference and being different from the social norms of the community as much as they were about, root women creating puppets and things, to serve their community.
Right. So delving into the third part of your book, the Book of Shadows, how do you encourage people to structure their beliefs and their witchcraft based on the fact that they have to do some research into heritage and finding what works for them? And how do you put that into a workbook?
With several hundred pages of heritage and theory for that.
Fair.
And then I didn't want to leave it there. So I wanted to give them something, because a lot of traditions are oath-bound. So you have to actually be close to a group that's practicing something that can bring you in.
Okay.
So I work with one of those groups in New Orleans, and part of this is a lot of the impetus for the book. A lot of people reach out that aren't in New Orleans or aren't near a group they can work with. So it's trying to provide, the third chapter is providing something practical that, not just giving you the history and theory and thought-provoking stuff, but giving you a sort of a complete set of material you can actually, go into your space and work with.
Is it more for the solo practitioner, or is it a guide on finding your group?
So it's not about finding a group, but it's the rituals can either be solo or group.
Okay.
One or many.
All right. Is there anything else about breeding devils and chaos you want folks to know that I didn't think to ask?
Well, I can discuss the title a little bit, because that's actually as you said, it sounds a little dark.
Hmm.
If someone's expecting a lot of dark devils, there's a lot of horned creatures in it, and the devil may make an appearance because the medieval devil was very connected to the historical concept of witchcraft.
Right.
But the quote actually comes from Kenneth Grant, who is a successor of Aleister Crowley, and was virulently heterosexist, if not virulently homophobic. And he decried two men getting together to practice magic, and said, you can't do anything without the female power. Well, should we say, use a different word, I think. And two men is just coming together is just breeding devils and chaos. And I've always loved that quote, and to me, it's very symbolic of a heteronormative, homophobic type of witchcraft or
Right.
magical practice, since he wasn't really a witch. And Joe Gardner, who sort of is the grandfather of modern Wicca, and held up as one of the heroes. He essentially was the first out witch in the 50s. And Gardnerian Alexandrian tradition stem from him, and many, many traditions stem from him, whether they admit it or not, was also virulently homophobic. And many of the early practitioners were homophobic. They were also anti-German, which the book goes into, because the Anglo-Saxons were very important in England and in Scotland, and you have, or northern England, Yorkshire area, and you have a sort of intentional hiding of anything Anglo-Saxon, and Gardnerian practice goes to great lengths to make everything Celtic. Okay. Because that's an indigenous British thing, and those Anglo-Saxons weren't British. So right. I actually have a lengthy historical chapter on how the concept of Britishness and its ties to Roman imperialism and anti-German sentiment. We view history as conquest and colonization, where peoples are wiped out and replaced. And that's actually not, now that we do modern genetics, that's actually not the history of many peoples, and the British people being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and might I point out, it is wonderfully queer of you to take something that was used as a slur and turn it into a badge of pride with your title. Congratulations. All right. Anything else?
No, I think you have to read the book. As I said, it's expansive. Someone else said it's expansive. So.
And it's scheduled for summer release. Do you have a specific date yet?
It'll be coming out in June, actually. So it's towards the end of the month. We have an event, a showcase in New York for Rebel Satori at the Bureau of General Services. We're a division. And I plan to have copies in hand by then.
Nice. Well, let's
and it's actually the one, I will add one thing. So Tom Cardamone has been doing so the last read. And this is not in his domain at all. And it kept him engaged throughout. There's a lot of hooks for someone who's not necessarily interested in witchcraft or occultism or folklore, including Crowley and Foucault and Burroughs, helps give an entrance to other people.
Nice. Well, and it sounds like it's less of a dry history course and more of a here's how this relates to you.
Correct.
Perfect.
And here's how it ties. I mean, tying those things together is an imaginative process in and of itself.
Right. All right. Well, speaking of Rebel Satori Press, let's talk about some of your upcoming works.
Okay. We have a dozen books, I think, coming out the summer season.
And how many had you planned on?
Maybe 18 for the year, and I think we're approaching 30 on our calendar for the year.
I love it. I love it. All right, well,
there's just too many good books out there. That's the problem.
And we need to keep our voices going.
Indeed.
All right, well, let's highlight some of those titles.
All right, coming out, let me see. Of course, the title we just talked about comes out in June. And then we have this sort of cyborg, human versus AI novel by April McLeod, which is coming out in a couple of weeks, actually, called The Switch. A book of photography called In the Blink of an Eye, which will be our sort of first experiment delving into a photographic book.
Oh, cool.
And it's sort of, a lost photographer. So it's a novelist we published, Eleanor Mayo. We published 5 of her books that came out in the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And she also left behind just boxes and boxes and binders full of negatives and slides. And just a tremendous photographic output that has only been exhibited once.
Oh, wow.
So we're putting that together with one of her essays. And then Library of Homosexual Congress has My Name is Rand by Wayne Courtois, who's sort of a tickling erotica book.
Okay.
And it was originally published by Suspect Thoughts back in the 2000s.
Okay.
Exit Wounds by Louis de Simone, and A Beard Paradox by Lawrence Schimmel, which is micro erotic fiction, I guess is what he's calling it.
Wow.
Translated from the Spanish.
Dang. And so people can go to rebelsatoripress.com to.
Yeah, we have all upcoming, we have new releases, trending titles. You know, we do the Netflix thing.
Oh, cool. Love it. And that is also a really good place for people to keep up with appearances. Do your authors submit like when they're going to be on, say, I don't know, a podcast or interview?
Yeah, so we have an events listing, which lists, physical events, book readings and festivals, signings. And then we have a very active Instagram and Facebook threads highlighting, like appearing on your podcast and things like that.
Perfect. My final question, and this is just recent news to me. You guys had a really good showing at Saints and Sinners, didn't you?
Yeah, we had about a dozen of our authors there. Every year it becomes more of a family reunion for us.
That is very cool.
So actually on our homepage, we have the family reunion photo.
Love
it's
it.
next to the community section because it is really about building an author community and a reader community. So that the authors are our family and the readers are our friends, maybe.
I like it.
But community is so important with so many people and forces trying to fracture that community.
I agree completely. And that's part of why what we do here is we're trying to build that community too. So again, hats off to you.
Oh, and same to you. Right back at you.
Thanks. All right. Are you ready for this year's Get to Know You questions?
We'll see.
Well, I'll start easy. What's your favorite writing snack or drink?
Coffee for the most part.
Nice.
So Star Descried was written on bourbon. With the assistance of bourbon.
Love it. Well, what books did you grow up?
It can be a little fuzzy at the edges.
You kind of got it though, right? So what books did you grow up reading?
Well, I can't say Dr. Seuss because I think a recent guest said Dr. Seuss Cat in the Hat. It was Green Eggs and Ham probably for me. And then immediately into Tolkien in 1984 by George Orwell. I can remember the first queer book I read, which was Perfect Freedom by Gordon Merrick. I was 14, found it in a B. Dalton and took it to England with a trip with my mother. And of course, I had two men on the cover. So she's like, "What are you reading?"
Can I ask how old you were? Ish.
14.
Oh, wow. Nice.
And it's probably the thickest book I'd read at that point. I was actually not that much of a reader as a little kid. Everyone was reading around me, and I didn't understand how they were figuring out what these letters meant.
Oh. What a turnaround your life has taken. Now you're putting them out into the world.
Yeah. We just passed 200 titles in March, so
congratulations.
Most of which are still in print, talking about preserving voices and evergreen is someone's fond of saying, I believe.
Yep. All right. Well, who has been the biggest supporter of your writing?
Definitely my husband. I mean, and he's the opposite of a reader. He's a doer.
Oh, wow.
He's also the absolute best publicist going out there. And when I forget to mention something, he's like elbowing me and tell him about this, tell him about that.
Yeah, we
got to write or to do anything. I have to stare at my computer a lot.
We got to give it up for our spouses. What can I say? Are you a morning person or a night owl?
I'm a little more morning. I'm more of a middle of the day, early evening.
Yep, I hear you.
For fitting in writing around everything else. When I'm working on a project, I force myself to get up early because dogs and husband just stay in bed for a little bit. So I'll get up at 5 as opposed to 6. get a couple of more hours in.
Yep. All right. Well, what is your favorite hobby outside of writing?
That's easy. Photography.
Oh, cool.
My degree was actually queer theory. No, they didn't call it queer theory yet. It was LGBT or GLB studies.
Wow.
The acronym hadn't flipped around, and queer studies hadn't come out yet. So that was my major in college, and then my minor was photography, art history.
Very nice. Well, has writing or publishing a, let me back this up because you write and publish a lot of books. Did writing and publishing your first book change the way you saw yourself?
Well, it's definitely very affirming. So my first book was published by a cult press in Oxford, and that so it's selections from a journal that I've been editing for several years.
Hmm.
And the reality does give you a little bit of fortitude to continue. Otherwise sometimes thankless
Hmm.
profession.
So if you were to write a spin-off of one of your side characters, or even a fictional account of one of the historic characters you write about, who would you pick?
This has to be the hardest question. Um, so probably the main character, Cade, in Dim Star Descried, that short story. I have a partially written full um, novel about him, building off that
Nice. Do you ever plan on finishing that?
sometime, but other projects keep getting in the way. Like I have two projects right now that are just warring with each other. One I probably talked about last year when I was on here, but it's one that has to be done, so I have to get to it.
Right. All right. Have you ever traveled as research for a book?
Yes. So the current book, Breeding Devils,
Hmm.
I would. So my mother was a research scientist, and we would spend a portion of every summer in England, so she could meet with collaborators and such. So this book has a large connection to those travels, and then we've gone back to Scotland and England a couple of times over the last few years, though COVID messed with that, to do some research for the book.
Very cool.
And then the
Well,
next project probably will involve a little bit of travel, some back to Maine, because it involves a Maine novelist that I'm writing on, or
very cool.
helping her write an autobiography, since she left behind hundreds and hundreds of letters and journals and other things. So I'm just, why am I, she writes better than me. Why am I going to put in my words? I'll just frame hers.
That's fair. All
But if you
right.
talk about being lost to history, so she was, and if I turn this around, you'd see movie posters in my library here. So she was a best-selling novelist, like New York Times best-selling novelist in the 40s, 40s and 50s, and also had a life part. She had a woman that she lived with. They built a house together. 47. They lived together until Eleanor died in 81,
Mhm.
and she's now part of the main canon of writers and taught in colleges and things. But she was also, in an out relationship with a woman in the 40s,
Mhm.
and was in Greenwich Village in the late 20s and 30s.
Did
So
she?
there's a history there which is possibly lost unless we recapture some of it. And it isn't about her just being in a relationship with a woman. That she had just an amazing life before she started writing.
Well, and the question I was going to ask is, did she write under her own name and not a male's name, like a pseudonym?
Yeah, no, she wrote under Ruth Moore, which was her name, which is
Very.
actually so. And her books are all still in print. She's on the third publisher. She passed away in '89, so the third publisher has picked up her title. She was originally William Morrow for her entire career, and her second novel was picked up by 20th Century Fox and became Deep Waters, which gave them the money to go move back to Maine and live as writers full time.
Nice. And yeah, I'd like to point out that accomplishment of, you said 40s and 50s, writing as a woman under your own name.
And that's actually, in some respects, well, you won't say hurt, but there's still a chauvinism there. So I help curate her, Wikipedia page,
Hmm.
and I actually got an argument in the chat version, the discussion part of it, because someone likened her. Well, she was only read by women. She was a housewife's writer. She was only successful because she was in the Book of the Month Club, and housewives read her. Well, so if a woman reads a book, it's not a good book. Only men
Right.
are allowed to decide what literature is.
Right.
And there's there's a reason a great writer, their books survive time. And you can pick up a book of hers from like Spoonhandle, her second book, published in 1946. You can pick it up today and understand the economics and the issues that she's talking about. And that book is also important because it has the first African-American characters in a Maine novel, set in Maine, written by a Maine novel. And she never comes out and says they're Black in the whole book. So a lot of people, she calls them the Portuguese. And people think they're actually Portuguese, but they're from Cape Verde, which is a Portuguese colony. And there was a connection between Cape Verde and the whaling industry. So a lot of Black people came over with the whaling industry and stayed, and they would bring their wives over. So there's a strong Cape Verdean community in New England. And she described skin color and things, so you can get it that they're not just tan. But most people reading the book think they're just Portuguese. And she's in the her job in the 20s up to 1930 or so, she worked for the NAACP in New York.
Nice.
So, she has that knowledge of
the struggles,
human rights. And she actually traveled into the South to investigate, for the NAACP, investigating 2 young boys who were falsely convicted of murder. And she traveled undercover because a woman was less likely to get killed. And she pretended to be a New York City reporter doing an article on Farm Aid.
Wow. And
one of the reasons I realized I had to write the book, she'd tell a story. And as part of her backstory, it was in some of her newspaper articles about her. But I never knew where it was or who it was. And the NAACP archives are very difficult to navigate. And then I was just out of the blue, the dean of the history department at the University of Arkansas emailed me and said, I see you've written about Ruth Moore, and my graduate class is doing this case, and she's all through the file. And it turns out the Ball Swain case was the one she was working on. He's doing an article about it with his graduate class, and he had her field report, which is essentially a 15-page short story with vernacular, with everything that would later be in her books, in her style. But this is her field report of her travels trying to get to Greasy Creek, Arkansas, through spring floodwaters.
Wow.
And her first contact with racism in the South in 1929.
Yeah, that's an important book. The one you're working on is an important book. That needs to be recorded and preserved too.
And she opens, and she's the epigraph poem on the new book.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
All right. Final question. How do you celebrate when you finish one of your books?
When someone finishes a book?
But when you finish writing one of you, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. You got me. Well, is there a point where you feel like, okay, I can treat myself to something?
Once it's out there for a bit, I mean, the work just continues.
And
and every time you pick up something, once it's in print, you find things you want to correct or change.
That's true.
But I think, and Tom's organizing this event at the Bureau, and I think that's going to be a little bit of a celebration for the book. Very
cool. Well, those were our questions. Let's give people some of those dates.
All right. So that, I think it's June 28th. It's a Friday. And it'll be at the Bureau of General Services Queer Division at the center on 13th Street.
Is it going to be online as well for folks who can't get there specifically?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm presuming they seem to stream most of their stuff. Then they actually just had an event celebrating Time Remaining. So James McCord published Time Remaining back in the early 90s, 93, I think. And Susan Sontag commented at the time, well, it just sings, which of course it had to go on the cover, right?
Yes.
But it was really sweet to watch. I mean, he's got to be in his 80s now, watching him be celebrated for a book that came out 30 years ago.
That is very cool.
Full house. It was just amazing to watch it. I couldn't make it up there, so I had to stream it, but it's definitely something worth checking out. Celebrating an author who was acclaimed back in the early 90s, getting to be celebrated again and revisiting a work that I'm sure he's proud of.
It's almost a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yeah.
Any other dates you
Part
want
of
to share?
what the Homosexual Congress is about is and unfortunately, a lot of the authors we're republishing aren't alive.
Right.
So it's good when we have when we have one we can actually work with and can see his book in print again.
Exactly. Any other dates you want to put in people's ears now?
Well, the events section. I'm always updating. I was updating this morning.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also be at Mystic South with Dave Gaddy, who published The Civil Magic of Wild Things earlier this year
Mm-hmm.
through our Every Manor imprint, and we'll be both at Mystic South, which is an Atlanta-based, mystic, witchy, pagan, heathen, whatever you want to call it, conference.
Love it.
All the
Well, let's give folks the web address, rebelsatori.com, and you can springboard off of that to both their events page as well as some of the imprints they have.
Yep.
Um,
Our titles button, which gives you our titles. We also curate some other titles, which are in a separate section. And then there's our imprints, which you can drill down to an individual imprint. And they each have their own personality.
And apparently what's trending.
Yep. It used to be top sellers, but I hate that.
Fair.
Trending makes more sense.
It makes a lot more sense.
It's interesting to sometimes books from, it's also small press, so a few sales will jump you. And it's interesting when a book, so the June preview, when this comes out, the June trending titles will be up, and then one of the top titles will be a book that came out over 10 years ago.
Probably.
So he just had either a new something's come out, or he appeared somewhere, or he was, name checked by Dennis Cooper or something that popped him back up into people buying his book again.
Love it. Do you have any final words of wisdom?
I put all the wisdom in the book, so I have no wisdom left.
All right, that's totally fair. And it's, again, a very important but also hefty volume.
Yeah, it's a tome, it's science, fantasy readers, and there's a lot of crossover fantasy readers and witchcraft readers, so they don't mind 600 pages.
Fantasy and witchcraft and history.
Illustrations and diagrams and things.
And history. Don't forget the history.
Yeah, it's everything from, pre-Stonehenge, stone circles, all the way through one of the final little bits of, we have lagniappe in the set in New Orleans, a little bit extra, Baker's dozen. So that lagniappe is actually a little bit on Man's Country, the bathhouse that used to be in Chicago.
Okay.
And how that ties in will be a mystery until you read the book.
All right, fair. All right, folks, we'd like to extend a huge thank you to Sven Davisson for joining us. Sven, thank you for coming back. Thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the support of the press and all our authors. Deeply appreciate it.
It's been our pleasure and honor. All right, we at Written on the Edge are proud to introduce you to new media by queer content creators. So if you enjoy learning about new artists or hearing our thoughts on entertainment media, please like and subscribe so you get the alerts for new episodes. The show was produced by Rogue Ravens Media, so for our disclaimers, links to social media or listen stations, or to sign up as a guest, visit www.rotepodcast.com. Tune in next week for your queer media fix.
Oh, what's that?
Closing time. The bums rush in melody, dear.